Okay, so welcome everyone to When Fire Meets Water, Healthy Watersheds as a Solution for the 21st Century. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for being a part of this session. I'd like to first acknowledge that while we are online, we're all joining from the traditional territories of many different ancestral lands of Indigenous nations across Turtle Island. Many of the reasons why we are joining here today in this conversation is because Indigenous land stewardship practices have been removed from this landscape. Therefore, we feel there is a strong responsibility in this community of practitioners and researchers and community at large to take action and amplify the voices of Indigenous land stewards and work towards holistic solutions for managing fire and watersheds at a landscape scale with ecologically informed approaches. I encourage folks to utilize this link that I'm about to place in the chat to learn more about the traditional territories from which you are currently residing. And so just a few housekeeping things from me. First, I'd like to just introduce all the organizations that are part of making this event happen today. I'd like to first thank Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions for providing funding to support this work. And we'll see Christy Ashione on the screen here, who has been a huge supporter and a huge help in making this event happen today. We had a bit of tech trouble leading up to this, so hence why we're a little bit of a haste new to get started here today. So thank you, Christy, for being our right hand there and making this happen. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists from the POLIS project, Oliver Brandeis and Andrea Barnett. I'd like to introduce François-Nicolas Robinne from the government Alberta. And we're just awaiting one more panelist, Craig Stewart from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. Just a few tech troubles there, but Craig will be joining us momentarily. And I'd also just like to name Shayla Ald from the POLIS project as well for her endless support in the campaign for this project, for providing these beautiful graphics that you're going to be seeing on the screen today and for helping amplify this work. And as well as I'd like to acknowledge Nicole Van Zutphen from the Raincoast Conservation Foundation for her work as well in helping with the communications and advertising of this event. Just to introduce myself, I'm Priya Puri. I'm from Raincoast Conservation Foundation. I will be kind of helping hosting and troubleshooting any tech problems today as well with Christy. I coordinate the forest program over at Raincoast, and I've been working really closely with Dr. Ruth Waldick for my time in this position to help advance conversations around watershed and landscape scale resilience for wildfire and use of fire to manage fire in coastal Douglas fir ecosystems here on the south coast of British Columbia. So we're excited to be continuing those conversations today in this webinar with these amazing panelists that we have on deck here. And so just a few housekeeping things. As folks noted in the chat, your video and your audio is turned off because we are using the webinar format today. If you can, ensure your strongest internet connection. If you have a manual plugin, I would recommend using that, just so you're able to stay connected with us long term. I'd like to encourage folks to go ahead and introduce themselves in the chat, where you're joining from, who you are, how you're connected to this work, and anything you'd like to share that can introduce who you are. If you have questions for our panelists, I encourage you to use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and then we'll be able to bring those forward when we get to the Q&A session of today. The session is also being recorded, so if you need to leave or if you had folks in your network who weren't able to attend, this will be available online and will be shared in a follow-up email as well. So as I just noted our speakers, we have Andrea Barnett and Oliver Brandeis from the POLIS project on ecological governance at UVic. Craig Stewart will be joining us momentarily from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and then François-Nicolas Robinne from the government Alberta, as well as Dr. Ruth Waldick, who is a lead scientist at Transition Salt Spring, who has a wealth of experience working on climate adaptation and specifically landscape scale projects to build ecological resilience with a main focus on fire at the moment. I'm going to just share another link in the chat for you to read more about our lovely panelists and moderator, and you can peruse this at your leisure. And so a little bit about how today is going to work with the panel. So you'll see our four lovely panelists on the screen here. How this is going to work is we're going to have a few slides on the screen to share a bit of background information about their work, and then they're going to engage in a guided conversation with Ruth to talk a little bit more about this work and address their Healthy Watersheds topic of today. And then we're going to invite the panelists to speak to a few more comments made by the initial panelists and have a bit of a conversation there. And then towards the end of our session, in the last 20 to 30 minutes, depending on time and how conversations go, we're going to open the floor to the audience for a lively Q&A to our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Dr. Ruth Waldick to engage in conversation, and we'll begin with François.
Thank you, Priya. So today, just to set a very brief context for this discussion that we're all very excited about, including the panelists, this is a third in what's becoming a series of practitioner discussions on fire risk and fire risk mitigation for South Coastal British Columbia. The first year that we did this with PICS funding in 2023, we focused on conversation around the resources and response that are dedicated to addressing fire in our region. And then in 2024, we did another one, which sort of took the conversation to the forest practitioners, land managers, and stewards to look at the realities, the challenges, and what's needed to deal with risk in this kind of unique landscape along coastal BC. The key messages that we got out of these previous workshops are really why we're here today. And today is one of two webinars that we'll be hosting this summer. And really, it's that we need proactive strategies that consider the landscape scale, and that's really what's missing. And so the conversation really shifted quickly last year to watershed health and fire being considered together. So today's panel was selected to help us to take a deeper look at this. And as part of this, to have a conversation about, the roles and responsibilities and how we can map a way forward in a watershed scale response. So we're starting off with François-Nicolas Robinne. François is with the government of Alberta, as you saw, and he's going to introduce the context as a multidisciplinary thinker and scientist who's really looking at the complex interactions across scales and understanding the watershed from the perspective of salmon all the way to watershed resilience and fire. So I'll pass it over to François to get started. Thank you, François.
Thank you, Ruth. Can you guys hear me okay? All good? All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, for the invitation, and for the opportunity to talk today about that. It's going to be like a few slides, pretty short and pretty condensed, because there would be a lot to say. But I think what I wanted to do here is just like quickly introduce like the topic. And when we talk about wildfires and watersheds, it's been a growing topic. I've been working on that pretty much for 15 years, and it's now a topic that is really like being front and center increasingly whenever we have like a fire season. But I think we tend to look at fires really like, oh, it's like this really bad thing. It's still very much like how society looks at fire, and obviously, it has that's what the message is now when it comes to watersheds and water. It's just this idea that everything fire is necessarily a negative thing and like is like a source of risk in the watershed. But I think it's much more complicated than that. So can I actually go to the next slide by myself? Oh yeah, here we go. So I think like the first thing I really wanted to say, and for people to keep in mind, even before talking about risk, about hazard, about anything else, it's like wildfires, or fire more generally speaking, are watershed processes. And it's really something that we need to approach this topic thinking that, any location, any land location is part of a watershed. And fire has been burning on the planet for 400 million years. So we need to think that those watersheds have evolved, or actually have been, they work to some extent, according to their what we call fire regime. So like how fire is going to burn throughout those watersheds is going to influence how those watersheds work, how water will flow, how erosion is going to happen, the amount of, the sediment budgets. And obviously it depends where you are in Canada or where you are throughout the world. But Canada being a very active country when it comes to fire, well, it's pretty easy to accept, I guess I would say, that fire is going to influence the way our watersheds and down the road our water supply, our aquatic ecosystems function as well. So I think, like, it's really something to keep in mind as we're starting to talk about that. It's neither good or wrong. It's neither a good or a bad thing. Wildfire is just a part of how watersheds work in Canada. And I'm putting wilds in bracket here because we also know that Indigenous people, have been working with fire, tending for the land with fire for thousands of years. And by doing so, they've also have influenced the way, the landscape looks like, which also means they have influenced, the way those watersheds work. So again, like we need to, it's important to think about that because it's going to influence how we're going to manage those watersheds when it comes to dealing with fire. And I think that can really help thinking about fire as perhaps a nature-based solution and thinking about how, perhaps for some watersheds, we need to have fire that, to keep those watersheds healthy, meaning that, we always talk, oh, we need more forest. Forest is going to save us. But you know what? A watershed that has too much forest on it is probably not the best idea when it comes to fire or when it comes to natural fire regime. So that's the first thing I wanted to say here. So next slide. So yeah, like now, like let's imagine we're talking about a fire, and from we're trying to think about how a wildfire might change a watershed and how it might impact our use of a watershed, like again, drinking water, aquatic ecosystems, recreational activities. So when we have a fire, and I'm again like looking at the sort of worst case scenario here, we have a ton of different fires and fire regimes like throughout the country. It doesn't always burn the same, but let's imagine here we have like the sort of things we've seen in 2023, for instance. It's burning hard. So what you're gonna have is just like potentially complete loss of canopy and soil cover. That's what you're going to see on these different illustrations here. And you essentially have ashes on the ground, like you go down to the mineral soil. You might have like what we call hydrophobicity here, what you can see in like the at the top in the top row in the middle picture. That's just essentially the soil gets coated in some sort of a waxy sort of substance that will prevent water from infiltrating, from percolating, and it creates a number of issues because then water, instead of going down the ground, is just going to run off from the surface and just increases like runoff, erosive power, these kind of things. You might also have changes to snow hydrology, so snow accumulation, snow melt. So it's going to change. You can see it on the bottom here, like you don't have any sort of vegetation anymore. So you're not going to have like this capacity for the forest to retain water. And again, like having this sort of sponge effect, like being able to keep the water in the watershed and have it infiltrate and feed aquifers, groundwater. And on the bottom right, you see something that is like an increasing concern as well when we're starting to have what we call smoke seasons. And even though you don't have a fire in your watershed, you might have so much smoke that actually you start to see some changes in terms of water temperature, like mercury deposition, water quality, generally speaking. So that's the kind of things now we talk more and more about, like people are getting more and more aware about it. Again, here, it doesn't have to be sort of value laden. It's just like the way that just what happens when we have a fire in the watershed. And obviously now with environmental change, that's the kind of things we see more and more often. Next slide. So now we're going to talk, we have, watershed, like wildfires they happen in watersheds. We do have a number of changes to watershed functioning after a fire. Again, it's neither good or bad, like it could actually, a lot of, again, places across the world, they need to burn on a regular basis to stay healthy. But the thing is, like us human beings, we do live in watersheds. Again, as I said, like all the land mass of the world can be divided in watersheds. We all live in watersheds, and we depend upon those watersheds for a number of things. And so when a fire burns, obviously, and increasingly so, we are concerned with what might happen after a fire. As you can see here, when those those changes to watershed functioning I was referring to in the previous slide, now that's the kind of things that are kind of those changes in processes can become actual hazards. So like they have the potential to cause harm. And here what you can see, like for instance, on the top left, you have like, like crazy erosion processes. Like this gully is like definitely very deep, so you can imagine it's transporting sediments, but also boulders. Like it's like the damaging capacity of this kind of events is like very high. You're gonna have debris flow, a lot of coarse woody debris. Same thing, like the capacity for damage is pretty high. You might have changes to water quality. What you can see on the top right is just like increase in like dissolved organic carbon. So you're just gonna have like something that is like, again, your water quality is going to change, and that might create some issues again, like for aquatic aquatic ecosystems, and also in terms of water supply. Yeah. So and one of the things, and at the bottom right, we hear a lot about it in terms of it's kind of a complicated one, but like this fear that we might have post-fire algal blooms. It's something of we do have increase in nutrients that increase activity, like biological activity in the water, but does it lead to algal blooms? This is another question. But like here you can see that after a fire we can have a number of post-fire processes that can definitely be hazardous for a number of activities that we conduct in the watershed. Next slide. And to have a risk, you need to have a hazard, like the previous slide I was talking about, but you also need to have some values at risks, otherwise you don't have risk. So what you might have, in terms of values exposed to post-fire hazards, you might have houses, cars, aquatic ecosystems, infrastructures providing water, storage infrastructures, like here, like at the bottom, you have a drinking water reservoir, a small drinking water reservoir from somewhere in California, and you can see it's filled with sediments. Like removing sediment from a reservoir costs millions of dollars. So it's really something like here, like nobody's going to die, but it's going to be for the society to bear the cost of cleaning this watershed, cleaning this reservoir, sorry. And so here you have a number of values at risk, values exposed to post-fire processes that can really lead to what we call nowadays wildfire watershed risks. It's a term that has been coined in 2013, and it's something that, again, it's now much more on people's mind, really. Like when we have a fire now, like the water topic comes to the fore within like the first couple of days of a big fire. So here again, like that's the illustration. Like I'm talking like worst case scenario. I don't want to say like, oh, anytime we have a fire, that is kind of things we're going to face. But it is true that if we happen to have in a watershed that provides water, drinking water, that hosts a whole lot of people, populations, perhaps pristine, I wouldn't say pristine, but like I should say like almost endangered aquatic ecosystems, and salmon it's a very good illustration of the problem. Salmon have been dealing with fire for thousands, perhaps millions of years, and have been here for a long time. But now we're dealing with like the problem of having populations, fish population, endangered endangered populations, that now we have to kind of choose, what are we going to do? Do we have a fire? Do we need to have a fire in this watershed to keep the watershed healthy, when we also have to deal with, yes, like endangered fish population, when we have to deal with drinking water issues, when we have to deal with potential post-fire debris flow, or impact to infrastructures, or potential pollution to water. So it's a complex question, and as I said, fire is not necessarily like here always like an enemy, a foe, but it definitely has like a huge possibility to create havoc in watersheds that we depend upon. Yeah, how do we go from a natural process that needs to be part of watershed for those watersheds to be healthy, to managing this fire activity, so we don't get to this kind of result here, where as a society we have to face like potentially catastrophic outcomes. And with that, I'd be happy to discuss. I'm sorry, that's pretty short. That's the time I had to talk about that. But oh yeah, like one last slide. When we talk about water security. So water security, like in the most simple expression, is just the ability for you and I to access water and clean water pretty much on demand, right? And as we dealing with environmental change, we're dealing with like more flood, more droughts, water pollution, microplastics, a whole lot of things that impact our capacity to access water in a healthy and safe way. But we're also dealing with changing fire regimes. Like it's hotter, it's warmer for longer, it's drier. We have like a number of like disturbances that accumulate in the landscape, like mountain pine beetle, droughts, more people in the landscape as well, which means more sources of ignition. So we have a number of drivers that are changing as well and are putting more pressure on our water security in our watersheds. So here, this is a very nice figure that shows all the number of things we need to think about when it comes to dealing with watersheds, wildfires, and keeping our watersheds healthy. A number of those things are being impacted and will be more impacted down the road by global environmental change. How are we willing to deal with that? It takes like the kind of discussions like we're going to have today. There is no like one size fits all and like one solution to all of that. As I said, all watersheds have different fire regimes, different fire history, different kind of like pressure from people, from a different various things. So like it's a number of things to consider when dealing with watersheds and wildfires. So again, that's not as easy as just like, oh, is it friend or foe? It's going to take it's a number of things to think about, and there is as you can imagine, no one simple answer to this question. So, but hopefully we can talk more about that. And I think like, good with that.
Thank you, Francois. So at this point, what I'd like to do is just, before we move to the next panelist, I'd like to open to questions from other panelists and have a little bit of an exchange among the panelists. But maybe I'll just start with my own question for you, Francois. So I'm seeing this relationship between the increased atmospheric rivers and heavy rains that we're having, and then fire and the interplay between these two things. But of course, we have a lot of different considerations, and yet this concept of what a good fire looks like is really a novel concept for people. So in a watershed, can you just sort of give us a very simple sense of what a good fire would look like from a case, particular example or something?
Oh, okay. That's a very good question, because it's going to depend. Obviously, it's I would say it's going to be driven by in part by the ecology of your watershed and like the vegetation that you're going to have on your watershed, right? Like if you have a type of ecosystem that depends on low severity, high frequency fire regimes, then like that's the best way to keep this kind of watershed healthy, is like to make sure you have this kind of fire activity happening. And I think that's something that is like fairly acceptable for a number of people, and I think a lot of the fire management practices right now, and like active watershed management tries to tend towards like having this kind of low frequency, low severity, high frequency fires or prescribed burns, but it might not work everywhere. Like we have a number of forests throughout the country that need to burn at high severity, rarely, but at a high severity. How do we deal with this kind of situations? Like, oh yeah, that might be the kind of fire you need to keep this watershed healthy, like from an ecological standpoint, but because you have a number of people in this watershed as well who depend on this watershed for, let's imagine, their drinking water, well, then you're going to create this kind of like pressure on the system that you have a good fire from an ecological standpoint, but you might have a bad fire from a water supply, a water security standpoint.
Right.
So how do we how do we, make the decision here? That's definitely a tricky question. So what would be a good fire? I would say from an ecological standpoint, that the fire that we need to have to keep the watershed healthy. And again, there is also a matter of, I guess, um, a temporal aspect to that. Like us humans, we tend to think about like a few years after the fire, and we're going to be like, oh, high severity fire is going to be a nightmare for the next 5, perhaps 10 years. But we published a paper recently that shows that, yeah, okay, it might be bad. A high severity fire might be bad for aquatic ecosystems for perhaps 10, 15 years. But on the long run, like you see that it actually rebounds and like to levels in terms of, biodiversity that are much better than pre-fire. So again, like it's a lot of I think we have to change the way we look at wildfires and watersheds when we want to answer your question, what is a good fire in
Yeah,
this context?
yeah. No, I mean, that's a really good answer, Francois, which is that it depends. And I think what I'd like to do later is get back to the conversation about, do we have the kind of data and models and risk assessment tools that we need? But I think we're starting to build a bit of the conversation and the context here. Were there any questions, quick questions from the other panelists that you would like to ask, Francois? No, I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, so thank you, Francois. So we'll move on to our second panelist, Oliver Brandes, who is an economist and a lawyer with the POLIS project on ecological governance and fire being a major part of today's conversation. And so Oliver is going to bring the lens of social, legal, and economic considerations to this interdisciplinary and complex watershed security conversation that we're having. So Oliver, I'll pass over to you.
Wonderful, and thank you, and nice to see all the panelists, and nice to see such a large group. Looking forward to the conversation. Maybe if we go to the next slide. I'm part of a two-part piece here because Andrea will follow and give you the really good fiery stuff. I kind of tend to set the context and kind of make some of the links, as Ruth has already alluded to, the wonderful bundle called law policy, but really that's all about governance. It's how do we decide and how do we make decisions at the scale of watersheds, and how will that relate? But I always do like to, and my version of the context is slightly different than Francois's, very complementary. I love how Francois gets the very specific details, but I kind of jokingly, in a somewhat serious and sad way, think about the drought, fire, flood, unsafe water as the 4 horsemen of the water apocalypse. These are the sequence that these events often happen. We're facing them everywhere. And what happens? Well, it creates this kind of massive water insecurity. We know what the amplifiers are. We got a shifting climate. We have poor land use practices, including forestry and agriculture and resource extraction. And we know the results when we think about it in a water sense. These water quality problems are mounting with diminished ability to proactively respond. But at the same time, and Francois has certainly set us up well here, our landscape is shaped by water and by fire. So we need both, but what's the right balance? And that gets me to my point, which I often like to emphasize, which is ecology matters. We have this synergistic relationship between fire, water, and watersheds, really. Fire being a healthy part of what makes healthy watersheds work, but at the same time, too much fire or fire at the wrong time or in the wrong place or the wrong intensity for all the risks that Francois has already shared causes a problem. So we have this kind of watershed priority, and it's not just for the straight ecology, but it's about healthy economies and communities as well. So next slide. I'm just doing a little teaser here with this one to emphasize fire behaves differently in BC's ecosystem. So we just take a smattering. Andrea will pick up on this, but that also means our governance needs to be different as we think about how we respond to each of these. Next slide. But when we start thinking about this governance piece, we talk about water and healthy watersheds tying to so many of the issues of the day. Whether we're worried about wild salmon, whether we're worried about reconciliation or how we're going to adapt, or simple things like food provision or providing good, safe, clean drinking water and the source protection that comes with it. And that's really where we put this governance matter. And I could have an elaborate governance conversation, but I like to keep it simple with this next slide, which really talks about, well, what is it about? And if we can click, this might be one of the click-through slides. May not have come through, right? Let's go back for a sec. What you will see here in this slide is the three corners are really about what do communities care about. So apologies that the slide didn't come through right, but it's really about three fundamental things. It's drinking water and having safe drinking water. That's the bottom left. The bottom right is about salmon and about the sort of proxies for ecosystems. And the top is us being able to respond to the extremes, right? The floods, the droughts, and really how do we do this? And that's all about local control. And that's really what governance is in a nutshell, delivering different outcomes on the ground for us, but how do we do it and who has a say? And then I like to just to really juxtapose the next slide where we start comparing wildfire and drought. They're very different ecological things, but I think, and a little spoiler alert, they're quite similar governance things. So we have wildfire as a frothy beast where drought is often described as a sleeping giant. Next slide. We have deadly and immediate. That's the feeling with wildfire versus drought, which can be slow moving and amplifies all the existing pressures. Next slide. And we see the threat to property and human life versus the threat to livelihood and fish ecosystem health. So again, you see the sort of broader systems problems versus the immediate. Next slide. And we see the responses are quite different in the sense that we need this intense response, quick response for wildfire, where drought is much more about changing behavior and changing our landscapes. Next slide. But what are we getting at, right? The fire can often bring communities together because we're there to help each other. We're often droughts divide us. But the fundamental problem is that they're in our law, policies, and our governance regime, they are viewed as temporary, short-term, and unpredictable. Every year, politicians see them coming and go, oh my, I didn't see this coming, and then respond in that way. And that's the point. That's when you start getting into governance solutions. They are not. They are not temporary, they are not short-term, and they are not unpredictable. We need to know they're coming. We need to know we have long-term responses, and we have to know that it's going to be ongoing. Fires are now burning multiple years. They go underground and they come back. And so we need this kind of broader engaged community planning and landscape level responses. Next slide. And here's some of the offerings, and maybe I won't go into too much detail here because we have lots of speakers still coming, but you can see a smattering. Andrea's going to give us a bit more on the power of beneficial fire to supplement or to, in essence, fight fire with fire. But there's a whole bunch of other legal and institutional tools. I offer a number here, but I think more importantly than the individual tools is if we look at the next slide, we see that this broader watershed security frame. And what is that? That's recognizing there's this interconnected nature of all these pieces. There's a water quality and quantity dimension, so you need healthy flows and source water protection, but that also means healthy wetlands. You need heterogeneous watersheds. This is both good for the water, good for the watersheds, but also good to build that resilience to fire. We have other components such as the need for integrated and nested systems approach. That's that kind of building of resilience where we're not just treating the ecosystem as something separate from people, that we have to really think about where we are on the map and what are we doing. And that's when you get into decisions and governance. And similar to Francois, I'm just giving you a little smattering. I'm going to end with this last slide to say, well, how are we doing? How is that program, that mandate for watershed security coming? Well, we have a real implementation gap. And this picture is meant to leave you a bit wondering. So do the two jumpers here make it or don't they? And we don't know. And because we're in the middle of that. And that is kind of the piece. When we think about building healthy, resilient watersheds, we're going to then also have healthy, resilient landscapes that will allow fire to be on the landscape and for us not to be undermined or fundamentally damaged by wildfire as a catastrophic problem. And so maybe I'll just pause there and then we can have a discussion or we can pick it up as a group later.
Yes, thank you, Oliver. So again, I'm going to open it up to the panelists to like raise your hand because I can't see you. Raise your hand if you've got a question. But one of the on your slide where you were comparing drought and wildfire, there's something that raised a question for me, that drought requires a change in behavior and wildfire requires an intense response. But again, from where I stand, that depends on how you look at it, because a change in behavior could be the solution to wildfire if we were looking at things more proactively and from a risk reduction perspective versus what we do now, which is kind of just try to keep ahead of the fires as they're happening. So I wonder if you could just comment a little bit more on what you see the difference as being between those two.
Well, I think you're exactly right. I think it's probably fair to say the way we have dealt with wildfire
Right.
through intense responses, droughts similar, and that's the thing I'm saying, that in common we treat them as short-term, temporary, somewhat surprising events, and then we respond, right? In a drought, we just take shorter showers or we don't water our tomatoes. In fire, we kind of respond and suppress. Both actually need us to think about this integrated, what's on the landscape? What is a healthy landscape? Is there enough wetlands? Do we have enough different types of tree stocks? How are we dealing with at the landscape level, but also the social level, meaning in droughts, how are we ready to respond? Are we ready to share water? From a wildfire perspective, are we willing to accept some fire on the landscape? In May and in October is exactly when there should be burnings so that we can get used to the idea that we're learning to live with fire. But I don't want to steal Andrea's thunder because that's exactly what she'll explore. But I'm saying, and maybe if the slide was misleading, this is how we're responding. How we need to respond is exactly as you say, in this much more integrated way. And that's where both water and fire become the same from a governance perspective. You need this landscape level, you need this multi-party, multiplayer kind of role.
So this is really, I mean, we could dig so deeply into each little 5-minute presentation from you folks, but I guess what I would say here is it'd be really nice maybe when we get to the end of the panelists to, if you have an example of somewhere where there's a actual effort to address the drought and wildfire issue concurrently or in an integrated fashion in watersheds somewhere. I mean, just how that might manifest would be really interesting. And then I'll just mention to everybody that we're going to invite our panelists to put resources and make resources available, because we know we're doing kind of like a very quick dive through things. And so you'll be getting an email that will provide you with links to some additional deeper information on these things. So that's an open question, Oliver, but maybe we can come back to that. And if there's an example, because I think it would be interesting to think about in what way the governance of these two systems could be combined.
And I can give you a quick answer, which is
Sure.
We'll just have to invent a little time machine because we haven't figured it out yet. Where society is kind of sitting right at the precipice. We know lots of the little interventions. That's that list I gave you. There's a dozen things we could do. Some of them are being tried in some places, but we aren't doing it comprehensively yet.
Right.
And so you have this kind of sort of pivot we need to really kind of think about watersheds in a serious way. That's kind of governance reform. I'm predicting 5 years out if we're lucky, but that's a good conversation for us to continue.
Great. Okay, so we need someone to kind of lead the charge on that. So I guess if we don't have any questions from the panelists, I will queue up Andrea Barnett, also from the POLIS project, and Andrea has got policy and personal perspective on issues of fire, and she's been working with communities and also thinking of it from a wildlife point of view. So Andrea, over to you.
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks so much to everybody for this opportunity. I'm joining you today from Secwepemc territory and really pleased to be here, and really just so grateful to see the number of people who are interested in having sort of an intersectional conversation about resilience that brings together water and fire, which are two of my founding passions. I will say Before joining the POLIS wildfire team, I have a long history of working in and around waters. So the sort of the natural marriage and the synergy and the reliance that healthy watersheds have on wildfire, as was described by Francois and by Oliver, really, really important. And I strongly recognize that. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the recent work that we've done and put a bit of a fine point on this idea of beneficial fire. For those of you familiar with POLIS's work, as Oliver describes, we don't do the science ourselves. We're more focused on law, policy, and governance. And so over the past couple of years, we've been trying to untangle and unbraid what has become a perplexing and really all-consuming, I guess I'll call it a problem in society around wildfire, with this strong recognition that these ecosystems that we live in across British Columbia and across Canada have evolved with fire as being a cornerstone to them. And so how is it, and recognizing this important role that fire has, how is it that we can grow as a society and learn to once again live with fire? Maybe I'll get to the next slide, please. Great. Awesome. So as part of our work, we like to compass ourselves to sort of future states. And so we put together these postcards from the future. And so this is one of them that guides our work as a team. And it is calling upon us to think and act and create in ways that allows for more beneficial fire on the landscape and also less destructive fire. Of course, we want that beneficial fire because, as I said, this is the way that our ecosystems have evolved. Culturally, it has been vital, particularly to Indigenous communities across British Columbia and North America, and also from a watershed perspective. It's really, really important that fire is on the landscape. Also recognizing that we have increasingly seen impacts of wildfire. And I think I can't see everybody's face on this Zoom, but I'm willing to hazard a guess that every single person here has some sort of a story close to home about some impact of wildfire in recent times. And as a society, this is certainly something that we need to learn how to better manage and live with moving forward. Next slide, please. One of the central theses of our work is this idea that in order to create a better wildfire resilience, what we need to better understand fire on the landscape in order to achieve that beneficial fire. So this is what we've been contemplating recently. For those of you, you would have seen in that slide earlier, we just released a beneficial fire in BC report. I'd invite anybody who hasn't read it to go and look for it, where we go into sort of a lot more detail on this topic than what I'm going to talk about here today. But one of the central pieces to that report, and a central precondition for us to be able to learn to better live with fire, is to develop and improve our knowledge of fire in order for us to be able to identify what beneficial fire looks like. And as I'll talk about in a moment, there's different dimensions to that. And there's certainly some important sort of community and governance aspects to it that are essential. Next slide, please. As Oliver noted, this is a slide you've already seen, but I just want to put a bit of a fine point on some of these, the issue or the fact that fire behaves differently in different ecosystems around BC. This is just a characterization at a very, very coarse level. Anybody who has a background in wildfire ecology would take a look at this and immediately see a whole bunch of different subsets of how fire naturally occurs in different ecosystems. But I would just draw your attention, because a lot of what we're focusing on here is coastal British Columbia. I would just draw our attention to the fact that these are also fire-dependent ecosystems. Fire ecology in this part of the world and in these watersheds operates differently than in my homeland in Secwepemc territory, where fires were frequent and often low intensity stand maintaining. On the coast, there is a strong history of fire, particularly cultural fire, indigenous fire, but also some other fire occurrences. Even though it hasn't been as frequent over the historical period, it does not mean that it is not an essential part of that ecology. Next slide, please. One of the sort of central things, continuing on that vein in understanding how fire works on the landscape that we've been contemplating at POLIS is this idea of the fire regime. So operating from this perspective that fire is different in different places, this is really looking at and calling upon the scientific community, traditional knowledge, other people on the landscape to really understand how fire has been in our various ecosystems, both in the historical period, in the contemporary period, and looking forward. There's a bunch of different systems. I'm not going to go into some of the details of this. You can see this is the map there showcases one of the ways that we characterize the way fire has worked on the landscape. There are different ones being evolved, but all of this moves to sort of compasses to the same point, which is we have to understand how fire ecology works in place. And we call upon ourselves to, further evolve the science and also the traditional cultural knowledge associated with these places. Next slide, please. Again, this is just to say place-based assessments are really, really important. So we need to have that scientific information. We need to have that cultural information. These assessments are rare in British Columbia. And where we do have information, it is often in the more contemporary period, which leads us, and I don't have this graph included in this slide deck, but if you look and if you can sort of think to a lot of the media coverage of fire, oftentimes it only goes back to the 1950s era-ish, which is when we really started to kind of record fire incidents. That is a very misleading baseline. We need to go a lot deeper and really understand what characteristic fire looks like in these ecosystems and ask ourselves, what kind of information do we need from the science community and culturally? Next slide, please. So as part of our report that we just published, we are looking at different dimensions of beneficial fire. And this has been alluded to both by Oliver and by Francois. A fire regime assessment and understanding what fire is characteristic on the landscape is a way of understanding the extent to which there is ecological risk, or whether a fire is characteristic or whether a fire is uncharacteristic. That is only part of the story. So what we have done is built a conceptual framework that asks us to look at fire and in making a determination of whether it is beneficial or detrimental on two different planes. One is on a sort of ecological level. How does this fit within the historical fire regime? And also, what are the risks to communities? So the idea would be, and again, this is just for rhetorical kind of purposes and to stimulate discussion, it's to understand when we're thinking about particular landscapes and fire on particular landscapes, where the fires might fit. So you have in the bottom left sort of the Goldilocks of fires where they're ecologically beneficial and low risk to communities. You can also have fire that would probably be considered to be ecologically beneficial, but present high risk to communities, which call into question around what is it as a community we want to do around these fires and what kind of interventions or mitigations we might want to call upon. Next slide, please. I'm going to have to speed up here. I don't want to take the next presenter's time. At the end of our report, we sort of, there's 4 different themes that we identify as opportunities for improving wildfire resilience and supporting beneficial fire, which also include watershed health, of course. The first is accelerating information and public understanding around things like fire regime. I would also link in their understanding of how fire and water, how that interplay functions. The second sort of family of actions and opportunities would be around establishing place-based planning and governance models that allow communities to, thinking back to that previous slide, assess the trade-off between what ecosystem benefits and harms and community risks might be. There are some examples. Hopefully we can get into some of the examples when we have a Q&A period. The third kind of family, of course, is improving community safety and preparedness. The more we study this, the more we really appreciate that it's very difficult to conceive of beneficial fire on the landscape if we do not have communities and individuals that feel safe. So this really calls upon us to elevate the importance of programs like Fire Smart, taking individual personal responsibility for our own homes, working towards living in fire smart communities. It's really, really vital. We can conceive and we can talk theoretically about all the landscape treatments we might want to do in the world. But if people aren't feeling safe, those are going to be really hard to pull off. So that's one of the kind of core findings. And I would suggest that this is one of the things like adopting Fire Smart would be a really key action if we're also thinking about this from a watershed security perspective. And then finally, it's this fourth one, which is socializing society and decision makers to the idea of beneficial fire, changing the conversation. And if you want to, next slide, please. From what would have been previously characterized as sort of the Smokey the Bear way of thinking about fire. Fire is bad, fire is detrimental, fire is something to be put out and feared, to Ember the Firefox, sort of the new characterization, which looks to fire as something that is constructive in many cases, something that we need to work collaboratively together to try to figure out how as a community and as individuals we are going to learn to live with. I believe there's one more slide, which I will go through really quickly here. When we think about talking about fire and thinking about fire in a way that stimulates sort of a shift towards thinking about beneficial fire, we need to be really cognizant of how we tell the story, with whom and when. So there's an example here of talking about beneficial fire and how we might tell that story between an urban and a rural public. We might also want to talk about it in terms of a coastal British Columbian and interior British Columbian. We might want to think about it in terms of, other different interest groups, whether we're, talking about at a watershed level, whether we're talking about wildlife, whether we're talking about industry. And then just a final thought, there's a whole world of conversation we could have about this, but going back to kind of this real understanding of real impacts and real trauma in a lot of cases that many people have felt with their interaction with wildfire over the last year. And just recognizing that to advance the beneficial fire conversation, one of the things we really need to do is we need to attend to and meaningfully address different perspectives that people have. Like, I don't trust people lighting prescribed fires in my community. I feel too nervous, or I'm really concerned about the health implications and impacts of wildland fire. And we need to figure out how we actually collectively in all of society way attend to those concerns in the interest of seeing beneficial fire on the landscape. That's it for me. I'm really looking forward to some discussion.
Thank you, Andrea. This concept is probably alien to some of the people in the audience. I just want to sort of point out one element of scaling this down and getting to the governance question, that in terms of having, has come up in a few of the panelists, this idea of a threat assessment and a risk assessment, and doing this at the watershed scale. I think that we do have a lot of these kind of tools. We have a provincial threat assessment, looking at fire. We have the Fire Smart infrastructure around your home and built, structures. And these are things that exist, but what we're actually talking about is different. It's saying this is more of a landscape. And so if we look at the coastal zones of British Columbia, so the coastal Douglas fir, moist maritime, western hemlock sort of zones, these are a lot of communities and individuals who reside in the wildland urban interface. So these are embedded people. and communities. And so it looks very different than, you know, this sort of more controlled environment where you have a city and the watersheds over there. So I just want to point that out. And there's also some confusion sometimes, I think, in which risk assessment we're talking about. Oh, there is one, right? So I don't know if you have an example of how the watershed scale can be looked at in this context.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I do have an example. Sorry, Ruth, that was directed to me, right?
Yes, it is you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That's great. Yeah, for sure. I think that what we are seeing is we are seeing pockets of leadership and constellations of groups that are coming together. I have a good example near Vernon, the North Aberdeen Plateau, where we have Indigenous governments, regional district, communities and Ministry of Forests coming together to look at the North Aberdeen Plateau, which is a source water area for multiple communities, and looking at what are some of the, in this case, it's largely focused on landscape treatments that can be done to reduce wildfire risk, particularly to the watershed and also to the communities. And it is certainly something that is being contemplated at a holistic level, and certainly something that I think ultimately will evolve to sort of be synergistic with what a community might be doing in terms of, you know, things like fire smart communities. There's certainly examples of other communities and other initiatives. I know that there's stuff happening up in the Northwest. It's certainly, you know, to your point around exposure and the wildland urban interface, that's a huge risk factor. You know, it was easy to talk about beneficial fire. If we're going to go back to the graph there, you know, there's a lot more of British Columbia that is now something that we would consider on the community's plane. And so it becomes a complex conversation. And I think, I mean, I'm very interested in what Craig has to say about this. The next panelist, I think this is a great segue. There's certainly collective planning and strategy, and there's also a lot of personal, you know, action and accountability. There's a lot of data, and I don't want to steal any of Craig's thunder or others. I know that there's a few folks here, Fire Smart coordinators on the Zoom. I saw in the little bios on the chat. There's a lot of very science-based ways to really reduce risk. And so when I think about coastal communities, when I think about Gulf Island communities, and I think about, you know, what some first actions and first steps might be with beneficial fire in mind, whatever that looks like in your specific ecosystem, I would really direct folks to think about their where they live, their small communities, and look at the very tangible things that can be done this season to try to create more resilience for themselves and others.
Yeah. But that raises the big discussion that I'm looking forward to, which is governance. Who's responsible and who's leading this, and how do we get this started? And I think that this is really a good point to shift over to Craig Stewart. Thank you, Craig, for joining today. So Craig is the vice president of let me get the title straight, of the climate change and federal relations. Did I get that right? Yeah.
Yep. Federal issues. Yeah.
Federal issues for the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And so really now we're going to hear from somebody who is like, this is really pragmatic view. And Craig, frankly, spends his time thinking about and advising governments about what we're all talking about and what we're worrying about, which is how are we going to continue to live with this increasing risk in our communities, regions, and environments? And also, how can we afford to go forward and live with the risk and disasters? So thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Ruth. And I'm not going to use slides, so I think actually this is an appropriate slide to keep up on the screen for for my entire segment. I will. I'll not repeat any of the excellent words of those that have come before me. By the way, I'm joining. My home is the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq on the other coast. I live in Nova Scotia, and but it doesn't really matter which coast we live in. We're facing the same new reality, which is that fire suppression and invasive insects have combined to create remarkable fuel loads in parts of Canada. In Nova Scotia, here we didn't expect to see wildfires 2 years ago at the scale that we saw them. It was relatively new and it was a wake-up call. And we just thought it was a Western thing that people were experiencing. And so it's affecting, it really is affecting us from coast to coast now. Right now, what that means is that from an insurance perspective, we measure risk, and risk has escalated, risk to lives and to personal property. And so we've been quite vocal on the need to do something about it and to change or adapt to this new evolving reality. We currently have 40,000 Canadians evacuated at this moment from northern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And this has become a yearly occurrence. Our problem is that once people leave their homes, often it's difficult to get them back into their homes after with impacted communities. We're not good at recovery in this country. And so we've been looking at how do you keep people in place for as long as possible while keeping them safe, and if they do evacuate, how do we get them home as quickly as possible? Managing this risk going forward will create tension. In particular, how we manage forests and the urban wildland interface and governance really is at the core of this. And an anecdote maybe to illustrate this. We've known what to do for a long time. Back in the 1980s, there was a fire ecologist from the University of Utah. Some of you will know about him much more than I do, but his name's Charles Kay. And he made the case that fire is very natural landscapes, that indigenous populations across North America had been using fire as a tool and had been intentionally burning to create habitat for bison elk elsewhere. And in Canada, a bright scientist in Banff National Park named Cliff White took up. He actually was a disciple of Charles. I think he studied under Charles, under Dr. Kay. And Cliff put together a fire management program for the mountain parks. And so this would have been in the 1990s. I worked on that program. And they were doing the right things. They were trying to restore fire naturally to the landscape, and it was to reintroduce. Essentially, it was to try to create better habitat for elk, to make them more accessible to the wolves that prey on elk in the Bow Valley. And they were trying to use fire to restore ecological processes that had been there 100 years before. The pictures you saw of the early 1900s was of a very different Bow Valley for you, those of you that have visited Banff and Lake Louise. We have black spruce wall to wall in that valley now. It wasn't like that back in the early 1900s. So there was a prescribed fire project that started in Banff in the 1990s. There were a number of burns done under that prescribed burn project. But in particular, in the mid-90s, one particular fire got away, and it burned past the Yahatinda Ranch into Alberta, into the eastern slopes. And as you can imagine, when that happened, the political support for the program dropped. And so even though they were on the right path, there was a difference of view between the folks at the province of Alberta at the time and the park. And so the political will to continue with that prescribed burning at that pace subsided. And we've seen the results, right? We now know that there's an intense fire load. Now they continued prescribed burning, and others I ceased to be involved with it after the 90s, but there was still fires, prescribed burns underway, but not at the pace that could get ahead of it. And at the end of the day, just and I talked to Ed Struzek last summer, right after the fire, well, while the fires were burning. Ed's a writer that some of you will know, and Ed is intimately familiar with Jasper, and he said, it just got away from them, got too far ahead of them. So in that situation, what do? Well, if you're Jasper, and we have to give kudos to the town of Jasper, they've had one mayor for the past 20 years. They recognized they had problems, and they did what they could. They became a fire smart community, and they took measures to protect the community as best that they could, even though they were facing the governance challenge that they didn't control the forest in the around the town, and they had no control over how that forest was managed, but they could do what they could as far as hardening the homes and trying to manage their wildland interface. And as a result, only a third of the town burned. And that's a success. It's going to take us several years to get those folks back in their homes, right? And that's another issue and another problem. But the reality is that it should be recognized for the success it is, that 2/3 of the town was saved. And first responders had a lot to do with that, but the preparation also had a lot. The Fire Smart preparation also had a lot to do with that. And so where that brings me is that we do have tools at our disposal. We know how to harden homes. We've got an Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction at the University of Western Ontario that does forensic analysis after every fire goes in. Scientists go in and say, why did some homes burn? Why did others not burn? It's, and a lot of it has to do with construction. A lot of it has to do with local vegetation, even at the property level. So we know that we can harden homes to deal, to deal with the risk, and even if we can't, we're going to be dealing with these for a long time. It's when the Palisades fire in California showed that embers can fly 2 kilometers. So if you have embers flying 2 kilometers, it's very difficult to create a deforested buffer 2 kilometers around a community. People love trees. They love having trees around. But being more thoughtful about how we manage, the urban wildland interface, what type of species do we encourage in those areas? There's still lots that we can do. And I'll end, because the title of this is Fire and Water. I'll talk a little bit about the insurance industry's perspective on how fire and water interrelate. At the same time, we're living in a reality where a lot more water is coming out of the sky than it did previously. We've got a warming atmosphere, which means we're going to have more frequent and severe atmospheric rivers. We're going to have the remnants of hurricanes carrying a lot more water inland than they did before, and dropping, we're seeing now 200 to 300 millimeters of water being dropped in a 24-hour period. It's impossible in normal circumstances for any stormwater drainage system in a city, much less, in a rural area, to absorb water. Low-lying areas will get inundated. But after a fire, that becomes much worse, and you experience that in Lower Mainland BC, where after the wildfires back in 2021, you had an atmospheric river, enormous amount of water fell, led to landslides, because no longer did you have vegetation roots holding the holding the soil together, and you ended up with, unfortunately, fatal landslides. And that's landslides are an issue. They're not insurable anywhere in Canada. You cannot get insurance for your home, your property, against landslides, because we just can't model them. The interplay between a burned landscape and then what happens with water after it rains heavily on it is very difficult to model. And so that's also an outstanding issue, I'm sure, in your part of the world as it is in ours. So I'll pause there with all those messages. Turn it back over to you, Ruth, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Craig. Yes, well, that was a really interesting context and examples. And I'm just wondering, this issue of governance is something that we've sort of been skirting about so far. And I don't know how familiar you are with, say, coastal British Columbia, but we have a more complex governance system that directly involves provincial ministries, and then some novel local governments, and some governments that were such that we have some islands that have staff with a capital regional district and island trusts. Some islands don't have that. Same with some rural communities, the regional districts may be a little bit more distributed. And we have, in some cases, volunteer firefighters with islands that are under-resourced, and this kind of schmozzle makes it really difficult. And so a lot of the focus is on dealing with what we can deal with so far is the Fire Smart model. But if we're talking to landscapes, I'm just wondering if from your perspective and the perspective of the Insurance Bureau of Canada and insurers, is that something that's been considered, is sort of the landscape scale and how to think about risk from that perspective?
Yes, there's a lot more attention being paid to that, because you can't simply focus on the property level or even the local community level and hope to get a result. As I mentioned, not when embers can fly 2 kilometers. You need to be thinking a lot broader about the interplay. What I will say about FireSmart is that we're envious about the penetration of FireSmart in British Columbia. You're way ahead of the rest of the country by necessity, I guess. We only have one community that's pursuing FireSmart in Nova Scotia, and it's an Indigenous collective. It's at least you're aware of the risk, and communities are really trying to do something about it. So, there are real positives. It may be a schmozzle when you're immersed in it, but it's a schmozzle everywhere, and you're a little bit further ahead than many areas in trying to figure it out and applying resources to it. So I just wanted to make sure I provided that context.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. So at this point, I'd like to go to questions, but first, I'd like to give an opportunity for the panelists to make comments or to speak to anything that they might want to. I'll just maybe run through you. Francois, is there anything that you have on your mind that you wanted to kind of raise or comment on just briefly so we can get to the audience questions?
Not right now, actually. Like I really enjoy listening to everybody, and I'm just looking forward to see how the question and answer session unfolds.
Okay, great. And Oliver or Andrea, how about you?
Maybe I'll just add a little piece which relates to, I happen to be a bit of a schmozzle expert. And in the world of schmozzle, the hard part is, and the unsatisfying answer is, there is no easy answer. There are multiple jurisdictions and there's multiple activities, right? So if it were one intervention, then we could probably pin it down and say, okay, who's responsible? But I think if you think of it more like a bullseye or a target with these kind of concentric circles going ever outward from right in our house, as Craig noted, ember management, really tight mesh above your soffits is really important, because embers getting in your house means destruction. Stacks of wood beside your house is really problematic, right? So, and you can imagine you go further and further out, and Ruth, as you well know, on the island, we have a very unique thing called private forest lands, and that is a very different management regime than, say, in the Crown. So as we move our way out, we have a whole different set of rules and laws and ways to intervene, and I think critically, balance the different values and needs, right? Community wants to have forestry, but they also want to have good land management. They want to make sure that they're extracting good value for jobs and community centers, but we also don't want to burn down. And so how do you find that balance? And I think that's kind of the $1 million schmozzle question of, you have to kind of work it in each region, and you have multiple players. But, to steal some thunder, Andrea can pick up on this, in our wildfire work, we're saying, listen, the province has a really critical role, and they can, deal with landscape at a much larger landscape level, and then they can enable lots of these little interventions. And, maybe in the discussion I can pull out, but we have a number of sort of no regrets kind of steps that you can sort of invest in and start doing right now. And are we doing any of them well enough? No, but we are doing all of them in some places. And so we have lots that we can pick up on and build on.
Great. So, and don't forget, we'll be able to provide resource links as well. Priya, did you want to pop in?
Sorry, I just accidentally switched my screen there for a second. Yeah, I just wanted to note the time. It's just we're at 1:20 here, so we have about 10 minutes left for our audience Q&A. We have about 8 questions in the chat here, many asking about governance and strategies for proactive management at landscape and watershed scales. I just want to flag to the audience that if we don't have time to get to your question, I'm recording all of these and we will be able to answer them in follow-up resources that are to come after this session. But yes, Ruth, I'm going to pass it back over to you to moderate the Q&A session. And just one more note for folks, I will drop my email in the chat. If you have a question that you didn't feel comfortable maybe sharing in the Q&A publicly and you'd like to just send directly to me, but you'd still like to see it addressed, you can send it that way. And anything that doesn't get addressed, yeah, feel free to just bump me over email and we'll make sure everyone's questions get answered. But yes, Ruth, I'll hand it off to you. Are you able to see the Q&A on your
Yes, I can see them. Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
So yeah, so there is a Q&A section for you to put your questions into. And I see I'm going to come back to the very first question, which is from Paula Chidwick, because we've been talking about governance a little, and I want to kind of wrap up with that one maybe. We have another question here, which is, are there any proactive steps or treatments that can be that we can do within watersheds or riparian zones? So I'd say maybe if we break that question down into 2 components, one is in terms of looking at a watershed, are there zones within a watershed? And then the second would be looking at the forest or the people living or the values within that system. What are some steps or treatments that could be used? And I'll just open it up to anybody. Actually, maybe I'll look at you, Francois, because I know we promised conversations about beavers.
Yeah, well, yeah, like the beavers are like definitely a growing topic, especially down in the US. Like there's some great work that has been done by Emily Fairfax and a few other authors, showing that beaver and beaver complexes, with like all those like a lot of ponds and like beaver dams actually like just create wetlands and like help to retain water in the landscape and actually like become this kind of like protected islands, like those refugia within like a burnt area. And they also tend, like as a refugia, they don't burn that much, but they also sometimes not at all. But they also, after a fire, they're going to help for, post-fire regrowth, just provide water around. So yeah, that's the kind of thing, like we can think about in terms of, we have a ton of beaver in Canada, perhaps not as much as we used to have historically, but we do have beavers. And I've seen like up in northern Alberta, like after the Fort McMurray fire in 2016, yes, some of the former, beaver complexes, like just like after a few days they were green again, so it's kind of crazy. Then how can that be leveraged for wildfire hazard reduction? Like I don't see why not, but then comes the problem of like accepting beavers in watersheds, and like we know that human beaver conflicts, are very, very common, and that's probably like it is like for any sort of wildlife sort of wildlife human interaction issues. We have this same sort of discussions with like grizzly black bears or a number of things. Like with beavers, people are going to complain that it's going to flood their land, or it's going to cut their trees. So like we go down again like in this sort of questions like, okay, that might really much help, and like keep water in the like rewatering our landscape. It's probably it's a nature-based solution, probably fairly cheap and effective. But then again, like what is the amount of social acceptability of this kind of treatment? That's another question. But yeah, technically speaking, beavers would work. Anything that essentially can keep water in the landscape, and I alluded to that in my quick talk, but part of like keeping water in the landscape sometimes it's also not having as many trees in the landscape as well. And I think like it's important, again, like on the global scale, like there's been this push for years now that kind of forests will save us. We need to even like afforestation. We need to plant trees everywhere. The reality is like the more trees you have on the landscape, the more water is going to get sucked out of the landscape. And like in California, they've done like really great work as well at showing that if you reduce the amount of tree cover, you can find you can find like a sweet spot where you can have just reduce the tree cover, reduce wildfire hazard, and get more water in the landscape at the same time without impacting too much water quality, if at all. So again, like there is a lot of work that needs to be done in Canada. Like we don't really know what's going on, but like there are definitely a number of treatments, and not necessarily like fuel reduction treatments. There are a number of other things that are related to keeping water in the landscape.
You're on
Ruth, you're on mute.
Thank you. Those would be good resources for us to just put a couple of examples up for people as well. And so I'm going to actually open to you, Craig, because I think now we're talking about tolerance and values at a landscape level, and I think the insurance agencies really, follow the values, but it can also kind of be leaders in recognizing values. Do you see anything in what Francois is talking about of like valuing wetlands or tools that the insurance industry is thinking about or has on hand that could be helpful?
Yeah, we've tried to actually launch a project a couple of years ago, a few years ago. Actually, COVID got in the way, but it was it was essentially trying to figure out a way of how you take a nature-based solution and make it an investable asset. So recognizing in Ottawa, the Ottawa area is a great one, because it controls so many wetlands within the city boundary, and about the conservation authorities around Ottawa found that about 10% of the flood risk to the city of Ottawa is attenuated by the wetlands upstream. And the wetlands were under threat, have been under threat because of development pressure to drain the wetlands and put houses in them, subdivisions in them. And given the floods that we experienced in 2017 and 2019 in the nation's capital, that just seemed like shooting ourselves in the foot. Like, why would you actually take away the natural protection? Calgary did something similar when they built the ring road around Calgary. They drained the wetlands upstream of Calgary that fed along the Elbow River. That provides some protection in the 2013 floods. So, but it's a tough issue. We're still working away at it. Is how do you actually, because we can measure a wetland as a storage basin. We can figure out how much flood water it would attenuate. We can determine through modeling how much damage would be attenuated downstream. But the question is, how do you build some sort of financial instrument or insurance policy, for instance, that would recognize that? It wouldn't be a housing policy, it'd be actually like a municipal insurance policy. And then how do you provide the reward, the incentive, in order that then takes that money and then directs it towards wetland restoration, rehabilitation, or conservation? We're not there yet, but smart minds are continuing to work on it, not only here in Canada, but elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Great. Those are great. Those are some examples I think people would like to see. We'll chase you up on those. So I'll move just to keep some of these other questions coming up. There's an interesting one here. I'm wondering if any of the panelists see the need for reform to smoke control regulation in BC in order to facilitate more controlled planned burning. And I'll just throw that out there to anyone who wants to answer, maybe you, Andrea.
Yeah, potentially. And this is something that I will say that I am certainly not expert on. Certainly there is a lot of work that's gone into public health recommendations around venting that would guide a lot of the fuel treatment kind of actions that we could do. It would be really interesting to look at how often that is an impediment. I'm not sure, considering that much of the prescribed fire, cultural fire, happens either in the spring or in the fall. It would be very interesting to talk to fire practitioners to see how often the venting index or some of the local smoke guidelines get in the way. I would probably open the question up though, and it may be something, from a policy and law perspective that should be contemplated. One of the big questions we have is, how do you want your smoke? Do you want it thick and dark in August? Or do you want to have tolerance for a little bit of smoke in November? Detectable smoke in the sky that might impact your mountain biking a little bit. Or maybe, there's real health concerns. Maybe these are times where we need to tell people that have compromised immune systems or compromised breathing, that, this is the time to go inside or install a HEPA filter in your house. I think it's a really important conversation. It's a really big rabbit hole too. People have very big feelings about smoke, but it would be interesting to, particularly from a landscape treatment perspective, to learn more about if that's an impediment. I don't know, Oliver, do you have anything to add? I know Oliver likes his smoke in November.
So I think that I'm looking at Priya helping me manage the time here. And if everyone's okay, I'll just take one more question and then I'll let sort of Priya summarize what the next steps are from this. And so this last one maybe is for you, Oliver. How can governance be improved to better incorporate wildfire and drought into land use planning? And a specific example would be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I think we are at the nascent end of getting good at that kind of integrated multi-value landscape planning that we need to do. I'll give you a couple characteristics, though, that we know. More local decision making. In BC, we're talking about co-governance, so Indigenous nations need to be front and center as core partner. We know that in BC, in most places, Crown lands is critical, so the province is going to play a key role. Even in places like the island or the Kootenays where there's lots of private land, there are some rules. They're not the greatest, but there are some rules to dealing with private forest lands. And so there's that kind of systems piece. Andrea did note one example. There's a few places underway. I'd say keep your eye out on the POLIS website as you see some of the work we're doing up in the Skeena area, the Bulkley-Maurice watershed, also some of the developments in the Okanagan. But I think it's kind of a bit of learn while we do. There are lots of very good tools. I'll just name 2 or 3 off the top of my head. Forest landscape plans, water sustainability plans, water objectives. These are all legal tools that exist in legislation today. Community watersheds, that's another designation. These are 4 really powerful legal statutory tools that are meant to deal with exactly this kind of situation. How do we make our landscapes more resilient? Are any of them landed yet? No, they're all underway. My job with Andrea is to urge them on, innovate, make them good and creative, and get them going. We learn by doing. But I will note maybe that a really important component is this dance, and this is the hard dance. People have to feel safe in their homes. So we have to simultaneously be increasing investments and efforts and understanding through things like FireSmart, as we talked about. We need to be changing building codes, but we also need to be trying new things on the landscape, either with fire or using fuel management techniques to get some of the fuel off the landscape, or as Francois says, bring back some of the more natural tree cover. As Oliver says, things like wetlands and riparian and healthy aquifers, these are all critical. So you need a nice heterogeneous landscape. That's what is fire resilient, with fire on it, and cultural and prescribed burning and managed wildfire is all part of the formula. So there's not one simple example, and I'm sorry I can't give it to you, but I gave you kind of a list of places where they're beginning the kinds of integration into the landscape planning kind of world. But we need to encourage our leaders to do better faster, frankly.
And
Thanks.
can I just,
Yep.
Ruth, can I just like segue on that? Like, I think that the truth about a lot of this stuff is that, and maybe some of the folks on this Zoom are inspired within their own community to look at what are the different potential avenues to have a conversation around fire on the landscape, healthy watersheds, how beneficial fire can really catalyze that, and bring that information to the table, create a better understanding about how fire has historically been in place, and with sort of this overlay of contemporary values and climate change, where we want to go as a community. Because, at the end of the day, and I think this was one of the questions in the chat, when there's an active fire incident, when there's active management, BC Wildfire, Ministry of Forest is going to step in and make the decisions. But there are a whole bunch of different ways, and sometimes in a co-governance way with Indigenous communities. I should acknowledge that. But the more information and the more established our governance is, and there's different examples internationally and other places where different groups within society bring a bunch of different information to bear and really articulate what beneficial fire and detrimental fire looks like in place that guides decision making when there's an active fire event. And similarly, are there as key decision makers and agents of change when it comes to a bunch of the prevention stuff. So what does our fire smart community look like? And what does landscape treatment or cultural fire look like on the landscape, where we actually do, on a sort of all of society level, have more agency and more decision-making authority as groups?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. And actually, I'll point people to the workshop report that's coming out from last year's workshop, where the practitioners had exactly this discussion that Andrea is talking about. And I just like to kind of close this up. It's not really closing it, but just summarize sort of the conversation. This is an ongoing conversation. It's really targeted at practitioners and managers and stewards. And some of the things that we talked about last year that we're continuing the conversation on is that fire is an essential process in the landscape, that everyone has a role to play. And in the coastal areas, we have so much private land that this is actually very complex and novel in a way, because we are really embedded in the wildland-urban interface. What I heard was that the province, there needs to be a mechanism. There are tools. It has to happen locally, but it has to be facilitated by someone. And the province is in a position to help enable something like this from happening. And then we heard some ideas about water security and some of the legislative frameworks, existing frameworks that can be used to do this place-based planning. But it still comes down, I think we're still left with what we walked out in 2024 from about 120 or 130 practitioners saying, which is, we've done everything we could. Now, who's going to take this the next step? And that is that governance issue, because we can have the conversations that Andrea is talking about as a community, but what table? There is no table. So this is where we have arrived, and you'll see a lot more specifics in the workshop report. And I'll pass it over to Priya to wrap up, and I'll just extend my thanks to everyone in the audience and to the panelists for this great discussion. I'm sorry you didn't have much time. I know how passionate you are on this topic.
Thank you. Yeah, not much from me. Just quick 30-second wrap up here first. I just want to thank everyone in the audience for your patience with some technical challenges that we were having at our end at the start there, and just for your patience staying 8 minutes over time what we had planned. And yeah, just to echo Ruth, a huge, huge thank you to our panelists, to PICS, to everyone who's been supporting this work for the past 2 years and who have all been a part of making this conversation happen today. We're truly so grateful to be able to be in this space and to be able to amplify these conversations and, move things forward ultimately in our region, but also just, North America, Turtle Island at large. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from these conversations. And I just want to thank folks in the chat for introducing themselves and hopefully forging some connections in that space as well. And just last note for me, you will be hearing more from me. I will be doing a roundup of all the resources that have been mentioned. I was noting everyone's questions down. So anything that wasn't answered, we will get you an answer and resources regarding those questions that were asked. They are all very meaningful, insightful questions, and we want to ensure that they are addressed appropriately. And then, yes, there will be some reports coming out from work that was started last year in workshops, and you'll also be seeing the recording of this being sent out. And so for folks that had registered in your networks but weren't able to attend today, you can let them know that they'll still be able to view this recording post the closure of this event. And yeah, that's all for today, folks. You are free to go. Thank you so, so much for your time today. I'm truly grateful to be able to have this conversation, and looking forward to the next one. Take care all.